Turns out Jackie Kennedy didn't hide everything behind those famous sunglasses. There's a new book of interviews which were given just a few months after the assassination of JFK, which includes some very pointed comments about the Kennedy family and other leaders from that time, including President Lyndon Johnson and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Joining us now is historian and CBS News analyst Douglas Brinkley. Nice to have you back with us this morning.
Good morning.
I don't know about you because, this is sort of more your wheelhouse, but I have to say in reading some of this, it seemed surprising her candor in her comments on a lot of these folks.
Well, I was surprised also. I mean, we have to remember she's talking on the tapes that Professor Arthur Schlesinger burned in early 1964, meaning made the tapes, tracks with her. And, she's talking about why Lyndon Johnson is perhaps not a fit person to be president of the United States. She has deep criticism for Martin Luther King Jr. She's trying to reveal what it was like to be married to John F. Kennedy. And I think most of the time we think of first ladies as being a bit mum on what goes on inside a White House, particularly her, because she stayed that way most of her life. But this book shows Jackie Kennedy unplugged.
Yeah, it really is Jackie Kennedy unplugged. So just to go back to a couple of things that you brought up, in terms of Lyndon Johnson, she says that President Kennedy said, "Oh God, can you ever imagine what would happen to the country if Lyndon was president?" and that he really had no desire for this man to be vice president.
That's not too surprising in this regard.
Sure.
In 1960, JFK didn't want Lyndon Johnson as his vice president. He took him because he needed to win the Texas delegates and win the Texas votes in the national election. Nevertheless, this quote's going to be affixed to Jackie Kennedy's name by historians now forever, and it just adds fuel to this notion that the Kennedys and the Johnsons didn't get along well at all. And she has some other kind of negative comments about LBJ throughout the book, and this, after all, is the sitting president while she's giving this interview.
Exactly, and some negative comments about Lady Bird Johnson as well. She also says this about Martin Luther King Jr. "I just can't see a picture of Martin Luther King without thinking, that man's terrible." That, too, will be connected with her now.
And the King part's even worse than just that quote. I mean, there's talk about what a phony King is, what a tricky person. She makes the accusation that when her husband was buried at Arlington Cemetery, that King was being taped by the FBI, and Bobby Kennedy had heard the tape where they were making ugly jokes about the death of John F. Kennedy. So there's some parts to that King Jack versus Jackie Kennedy square off, if you like, that's going to be very cited in future books that deal with the 1960s. It's guaranteed.
Are you surprised at all about the release of this at this point, and that it would, sort of be given a green light?
Somewhat. I was close to Arthur Schlesinger, the professor. He died a few years ago. Ted Sorensen, one of the other keepers of the flame, died. And I think Jacqueline Kennedy thought it's the 50th anniversary right now of the Kennedy presidency, and this is sitting there, and it was time to let her mother have her say, and decided to come public with this. It's just a lot of the rawness of her feelings, I think, as a young woman she's only in her 30s when she's doing these tapes in 1964, is very different than the more poised and discreet Jackie Kennedy we got to know in the 1980s and 1990s.
Yeah, well, fascinating stuff. Douglas Brinkley, good to have you with us this morning to break some of it down. Thanks.